you guys remember, uh, Freud talked about the period of middle childhood as a dormant period of sexual energy. So there was no attraction, sexual attraction between the two sexes. This period is going to end with the onset of puberty and with adolescent. First romances are going to start to appear, and that attraction usually happens in high school. However, those are early crushes that tend to not last longer than a year. Girls tend to have or claim to have a steady partner more often than boys. However, that exclusive commitment is really ideal and ends up with a lot of incidents of cheating, flirting, breakups that tend to be more harsh on the emotions of adolescents, causing them to engage sometimes in impulsive sex or cruel revenge, or fall into deep depression or suicide. Friends always help and support each other cope with those romantic ups and downs, and this is why we say that peer pressure is not necessarily something negative. Sometimes it is actually the only way that friends can cope and get through a hard experience or a romantic experience or relationship. Something to note here is that, contrary to what most parents might think about teenagers, they tend to have more platonic friends of both sexes than what adults think. So, not every relationship has to be sexual. As a matter of fact, in one study back in 2015, more than 40% of all the graduating seniors were virgins. So, we're seeing that. Control of sexual activity come back. We see it more in some cultures than others, in some cities more than others, and definitely sometimes it has to do with family cultural background and religious affiliation. We see, for example, girls from religious families who are closely related and connected to their parents tend to be romantically involved with boys who come from the same family alliance and share the same values, and therefore it kind of slows down that sexual activity. Another important topic here is same sex romance. And remember, we talked about how teenagers or adolescents engage in a search for their identity. And we talked about gender identity, closely related to gender identity, and how it needs to be fluid during this period and explored, is sexual orientation. And sexual orientation refers to that sexual attraction that the adolescent will have, and how they want to be romantically involved with someone from the same sex, the opposite sex, or both sexes. Sexual orientation can be very strong or weak or overt or secretive or unconscious or during those years. Similar to gender identity, is extremely fluid and it's experimental, and it does not solidify um, um, uh, during those years. As a matter of fact, sometimes it is affected by the culture and the cohort and the acceptance or rejection of society to that orientation. With sex and romance, we have to talk about sex education, and many adolescents have really strong sexual feelings and urges with a very limited prefrontal cortex development. So that can be a trigger for them to seek that impulsive action and engage in unsafe sex. what can help during this period and what we're seeing is a call for better sex education during early years when we're seeing puberty, the trend of puberty hitting at earlier years. Unfortunately, we're not seeing a trend of sex education becoming competently starting at an earlier age. Um, Children continue to get their sex education from the wrong sources. Who's teaching them? Well, they get it from media. Sexual content is notorious on TV. It appears 7 times per hour during most teenage programs. So, given the emotions and the poor judgment and the hormones and everything that's going on in the body of a teenager who's exposed to that sexual content, then you get a person who doesn't have a realistic picture of what could be the consequence of engaging in risky sexual behavior. So, those commercials or those shows do not really show the reality of risky behavior. It does not show a character with who has contracted STI, or a teenager who ended up pregnant and had to pretty much forego her life to take care of that child, or there is no mention of safe sex or using condoms. These are the things that are lacking when it comes to sex education in the media. Parents are also at fault because many parents are unfortunately in denial about that stage of development. They really do avoid the specifics and the talk, and they really rely on the assumption that their child is not sexually active, or that the child is going to do the right thing. They're not really being actively supportive and actively engaging in open communication, in warm, effective in communication about the risks of such behavior. Peers offer a lot of support. Sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative. Adolescent sexual behavior is strongly influenced by their peers. If the peer group is exercising virginity or abstinence, they will tend to be all engaged in the same activity. However, if they are actively sexual, sometimes feeling left out or isolated and not able to talk about your experiences might push you to actually engage in something that you might not want to otherwise. Um, Educators, and this brings us to schools. Unfortunately, sex education in the United States is not up to par compared to other countries that understood the importance of such education at an early age and the content of the education. So the timing is important because we're seeing an earlier onset of puberty, and content is also important. The rates of teenage pregnancy in most European nations is less than the United States. Why is that? Well, research suggests that sex education in the United States is delayed. It should begin in early adolescence, and this means that we should be targeting literally children who are in 6th grade and 7th grade, not waiting until we assume that children are sexually active. And of course, it should be informative than prohibitive. When you give the content that relays the message of here's the information, don't engage in risky behavior, it's different than when you tell the child that here's the information, don't engage in risky behavior because this is what could happen. However, if you choose to do so, here is what you need to know, or here's what you need to do.